Sure. Okay. Hi, this is Linda Glauben, and today is Tuesday, November 28th, 2023, and I'm here with Evan Rosenhouse. We're going to video his history today. Evan, hi.
Hello, I'm Evan Rosenhouse. I was born in Dallas in 1982, so a little bit ago, but not as far back as my family goes. I grew up originally living near Campbell Green, went to Solomon Schechter for preschool, now Slovene Academy.
Right.
Lived there until I went away to college. Grew up at, for the most part, Shereth, Israel. When I was bar mitzvah, I started going to Ohev Shalom as well. I shul hopped a little bit in high school between Shereth, Ohev, Shari Tefillah, back to my family's original shul of Tiferet Israel, where my great-great-grandfather was the first president.
And his name?
His name is his name was Frank Byers.
Frank Byers. Okay.
He was the first president of Tiferet Israel back in the 1790s. In the 1890s? We start over.
That's okay. Just go ahead. We'll edit it out.
All right.
So it's okay.
So
Don't worry.
He was the first president back in the 1890s. My family's been here for a while. As I realized it when my kids were born, I was talking to one of my cousins, Scott, and he goes, "Are we fourth generation, fifth generation? Where are we?" I'm like, "Well, we're fourth generation born in Dallas."
Amazing.
But we're fifth generation members of the community, and my kids are fifth generation born, sixth generation members of the community.
That's amazing. What a wonderful legacy. That's awesome. Yeah. So, it's your great-great-grandfather, right? Where was he originally from?
I'm not sure exactly where in Russia he was originally from, but I'm pretty sure he was from Russia.
Russia.
And then my grandfather's father was born here in Dallas. My grandfather was my grandfather is Dr. Jerome Byers. He was born at Parkland. My mother, Marilyn Rosenhouse, was born maiden name Byers at Florence Nightingale, which is now Big Baylor downtown. My brothers and I were all born at Presby on Walnut Hill.
Yeah. So many of them were, right? Yeah, great. So growing up, Solomon Schechter,
I went to Solomon Schechter for preschool and through kindergarten with Miss Myers. I had Miss Myers in kindergarten. I had Sandra Cohen, now Cantor, was one of my preschool teachers. Used to love Rabbi Eddie's Friday program. Back when I still remember one of my favorite ones was one of the secrets that people used to find out on Rosh Hashanah especially. You always wanted to go up and say Good Shabbos and Good Yontif to the rabbi. Why? He kept M&Ms in the pulpit.
Oh.
So you came up, you got candy from the rabbi.
That's fun. That's that Rabbi Feinstein?
That was Rabbi Eddie Feinstein.
Yeah, he married me.
The other one that's kind of a fun one is you used to see him do a little dance when he would get back behind the pulpit, and a lot of people didn't know this, but if you ever look, he used to wear loafers when he came out, because behind the pulpit, he kept a pair of Reeboks. A lot more comfortable to stand.
And he would change his shoes.
You would see him like, you didn't know what it was that he was, it looked like he was doing a little bit of a dance.
Yeah, yeah.
It was him changing shoes.
That's funny.
Things you remember from like being a little kid that
Wow.
my parents, until probably my little brother's bar mitzvah, until then they were a toplets auditorium for the High Holidays family, where they would bring back, Rabbi Eddie would come back every year for the toplet service.
Which is where I sat for many years. Yeah. So tell me about your family, like your parents and your siblings. How many siblings do you have?
So I've got one older brother, David, one younger brother, Michael. David, I think one of his highlights was he was in addition to going to Schechter until he started middle school, when he started middle school, we started going to public school. We started going like he was 4th, 5th grade, we started going to public school. When we moved in 1990, he started at Renner Middle School, which is now Shepton High School again. But one of the big things I remember was he was one of 17 original students at Yavne, back when Yavne Academy was housed in the lodge in the back of the JCC.
I remember that. So that's great. He was one of the original high schoolers.
Right. He was a member of the first 4-year class of Yavne.
Wow, wonderful.
The first class to go.
Did you go to Yavne?
I went 2 years to Yavne, and then I returned to public school. I graduated from Plano West.
Very nice.
Following graduation from Plano West, I realized I was missing my Judaic studies. I went for the next 10 years to Yeshiva University, where I got my associate's degree, my bachelor's degree, my master's degree, and I studied for rabbinic ordination.
Very nice.
Got married while I was in grad school. My wife is from Huntington Beach originally, in California. Her father used to go, "Where are you going to find a guy that's Jewish and likes country music?" Oh, she found a guy from Dallas. And a few years into our marriage, we moved. When we were looking at, we want to start looking into starting a family. You can't really start a family and have a yard if you live in Manhattan. So we moved back to Dallas. I now live about 1.5 miles, 2 miles from where I grew up, just south of the Renner Frankfurt Library. When I originally moved to that house, our house was the 6th house built in the neighborhood, and it was an open field between 2 doors down from me and the library. Now there's a whole development there. When I went to Schechter, there was a sheep farm in front of the school on one side and a 2-building church that got incorporated into Schechter Sheriff, became Beit Aryeh, and then became a football field and parking lot. But as I said, I've been around for a little while.
Yeah, you have great history, and just Dallas, not just the Jewish community, but Dallas and how it expanded north.
Well, I remember when my grandparents, when I was growing up, my grandparents lived in University Park. So when they were looking to move out of their house, they decided they wanted to move into a senior community, and Erickson Senior Living was right across the street from me, being built as a new community.
Yeah.
I went to my grandmother, I'm like, "Baba, why don't you move, right across the street from me is this new place. I could walk to you guys on Shabbos, and we could bring the kids and visit." She looks at me and goes, "Evan, I've never lived north of LBJ, and I don't intend to start now." My grandmother you can find her oral history already on the site. It's Hazel Byers. She was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, raised in Louisville.
I'm from Pittsburgh.
And she moved to Dallas with my grandfather back in by the time they actually moved back, it was the mid-50s, 60s, because my grandfather was in med school when they first got married. So my grandfather was in med school in Galveston. He says to his pregnant wife, "You're going to go up and stay with my parents in Dallas for the last part of your pregnancy," figuring he's not going to be in the delivery room anyways.
At that time, they didn't have it right.
They lived, my grandfather's parents still lived in Dallas. So he goes, "Go up to my parents' house, you'll stay there, you'll be taken care of." He was in med school in Galveston, so at that point, probably a 6 to 8 hour drive.
Oh, wow.
Well, now it's a 4-hour drive, but when I still remember when going from my house just south of Renner Frankfurt Library, to eQuest, which I used to do every week. I was in therapeutic horsemanship program from the time I was 5.
Oh,
So I used to go out. They were on the shore of Lake Ray Hubbard, and it was a 45-minute drive from my house to Wiley. Now, I said to my wife when we were moving back from, or I was moving back from New York, she was moving to Dallas from New York, and I said to her, the GPS pulls us off in Royce City, Texas, with a 16-foot Penske truck. She says, I'm like, I looked at the GPS and I'm like, okay, I see 78 and 544. Once we get to 78 and 544, I can drive back from there like the back of my hand.
wow.
Sure enough, I almost passed it because it had gotten built up so much in the time since I had last been there. Because when I left, it was there was
2-lane
there was
road.
there was a McDonald's and a Subway, and that was it.
Now it's like strip centers. Yeah. So tell me how your life in Dallas, in the Jewish community, has become rooted.
Well, as I mentioned before, I think my family's always been rooted in the Dallas Jewish community.
I mean, you yourself.
Me, myself, I grew up at Shereth. I was bar mitzvahed by Rabbi Weinberg at Shereth. He's now at Anshe. When Ohev Shalom first moved from Hillcrest and Arapahoe, they moved and bought a house that I can still lay out the actual house that I was bar mitzvahed in. It's now turned into their synagogue at Hillcrest and McCallum. But thankfully, I've seen the synagogue now bursting at the seams again. Needs another remodel to fit everyone. But with all the construction and the size of the parking lot, we can't build any further. But I've seen the entire building of that community. I grew up, I didn't go to Akiba, but my kids now are Akiba students for the last, my daughter's in 6th grade, my son's in 2nd. We started going to Akiba from the time my daughter was in kindergarten, when Rebbitzin Rifki Block says to us after my daughter got out of Gangani in Plano, she goes, as far as schools, I can't really say anything bad about Akiba. I have 5 children who all graduated from there. I'm like, that's pretty stellar of a recommendation.
Yeah,
So
it's great
we
testimony.
We continued. We moved over from Gangani in Plano. We moved up to the school at Akiba, which is now merged with Yavna. So I went to Yavna. I went to Schechter. My kids now go to Akiba Yavna. I came back one summer one year from YU. I came back during Torah tours, and I remember Yavna being in the portable buildings
Right.
at what used to be Ola Pedrita, which is now their current location. But I remember, when I was in Yavna, the home court was the white building on Churchill. So I've been through many iterations of Yavna, many iterations of Akiba. My brother, when I was a freshman at Yavna, my freshman class was 20 people and doubled the size of the school from my brother, who started when they were 17. I came back to Dallas from New York. I've worked off and on for the Vadakashras Dallas.
Okay.
Between the different restaurants, caterers. The scary one is, during the summer I now work for a camp up in Pennsylvania, and I went and I looked and I'm like, wait a minute, I've been in industrial kosher food for the last 23 years. And that was like, I've been in kosher food service longer than half these kids have been alive that are working with me as colleagues.
It's an eye-opener, isn't it? So tell me about that. Tell me about working in that particular market, let's call it, because it's very, in Dallas, I remember, there was very little availability of kosher food or restaurants or products. So tell me about that here and how that's, what you do with that.
So, from my memory growing up, there used to be one kosher market. It was Reichman's kosher market at Quentin Campbell. That then got, when Israel Reichman decided he wanted to retire, he was going to make Aliyah to Israel. He sold the business to Debbie Linksman, who changed the name to Kosher Link. I don't remember a time when the Minyards or the Tom Thumb at Preston Forest didn't have a kosher bakery. Like, they've always had the kosher bakery, but they then added the kosher meat counter when at some point the small mom and pop shop of Kosher Link no longer could compete because Albertsons across the street from them opened a kosher counter, and a mom and pop shop, no matter how hard they try, are not going to be able to compete with a national chain for buying power. But I remember that one when I came back to Dallas. I mentioned that I worked for a while for the VOD. One of my longer postings was before my daughter was born, there was a standalone butcher shop called Kosher Bee in East Plano. So I was there, Mishkiach Tamid, I was there standing Mishkiach, there for a while. And then a couple years later, I was the Mishkiach for the JCC senior meal service until my son was born.
Nice.
I've worked off and on with Dallas VOD for different events around the city, different caterers.
So that is your current career?
No, currently I work full-time for my family's tax accounting practice as their firm administrator, but I do the hashgacha, I do kosher supervision work during the summer so that my kids can go to camp.
I see. It's a nice gig.
Yeah. My daughter goes, I go to camp for free. It's like, no, you don't. just because you don't pay for it out of pocket doesn't mean that you don't pay for it.
Might be free for her.
Talk to my body after a summer of getting up. I'm in the kitchen by 6:15 every morning.
Wow.
And I get out about 8 o'clock at night after dinner's done.
Have you had a lot of challenges with the kosher practice in Dallas, like as far as commercially and personally, here in the city? I know it's changed tremendously over the years, but tell me about that and how you've seen the change.
I mean, there are definitely, so one of the things I remember was, for one thing, I wasn't always kosher specific. My family grew up, we would keep kosher at home. You ate kind of what you wanted out.
Okay.
So, kosher wasn't necessarily a restriction on going out. A couple of the fun ones. But it was one of those ones that I've seen kosher restaurants come and go like sands through an hourglass. I guess would be a nice way to put it. And it used to be like, how do you know a kosher restaurant would survive? Does it last through Passover, where they're not going to be open for Pesach? Will they survive that week closure, followed by the 3 weeks where you also probably don't have many meat restaurants that are going to be open?
Keep talking.
I I've seen a lot of different variations of kosher restaurants here in Dallas. I remember when Lowell Michelson, who runs Simply Kosher Catering now, he originally started out with, at one point, he decided to open a kosher pizza place. And it was the question of, it was the only kosher restaurant in town at that point, and people didn't want to necessarily do the New York style pizza shop where you stand up at the counter, they wanted a full service, so that ended up not working out for one reason or another. Even before that, I remember there was, back when must have been when I was 4 or 5, Mara Levy had a kosher restaurant here in the JCC called Mara's Menu, where it was up next to what's now the kitchens off the hallway behind the auditorium. There used to be a full-service kitchen back there that then became Kosher Kids Cafe when she left for New York. I've seen kosher restaurants come, I've seen kosher restaurants go. Currently, I think there's more kosher restaurants than we've ever had.
That's great.
In the city. A wide-ranging variety. I've got my favorites. I've got some that aren't so much my favorite.
Well, it's something for everybody, right?
Right. One of my favorite stories I used to have was my grandparents. My grandfather's grandfather was the rabbi in Dallas.
Your grandfather's grandfather.
My grandfather's grandfather,
Wow.
Frank Byers, when he started Tiferet Israel, was a kosher grocer, a moil, the de facto rabbi. He was the one-stop shop when it came to Judaism. My grandfather himself couldn't care about Torah observance, I think, if you paid him.
Really?
He really didn't care. Yeah.
But he lived that life.
My grandfather was a doctor in Oak Cliff. His favorite restaurant, like when my father came to meet him, it was at Norma's. My father tells the story, he used to walk through a blue cloud of smoke because Dr. Byers had the back corner during lunch. So the first time he came to meet him, he had to walk through a blue cloud of smoke back in early 1970s.
Was that the one over on Harry Hines? Or, yeah.
It was,
Like
Oak
Walnut
Cliff,
Hill?
the Oak Cliff area.
Oh, okay.
Because my grandfather had his practice in Oak Cliff, and he was a attending physician ophthalmologist at Methodist out in Oak Cliff.
Did he grow up in South, were they in South Dallas? Is that where a lot of the
To the
Jewish
best of
community
my-
was?
To the best of my knowledge, it was around Alamo Street. Alamo Street, Bryan Street.
Downtown, like uptown.
Kind of just north of Fair Park.
Okay, so yeah, in that South Dallas area.
South
Yeah.
Dallas area. Like, I one time asked my grandfather, there's a book about Dallas Jewish history called They Came to Stay, which anytime someone comes and I find out they're new and they're interested in the history, I go, have you seen this book? I one time was asking my grandfather, he goes, Evan, go back in the day and I've got this book on the shelf. Sure enough, it was the same book that I just bought a copy at Half Price Books. And he goes, here's a picture of my father and my grandfather from one of the first like congregational pictures of Tiferet Israel. And I was like, do you remember your grandfather's house on Bryan Street? He goes, the old wooden house isn't there, but Exlar Park still is.
Wow.
My grandfather, when I was in rabbinical school, I was studying Maimonides and I was struggling with something. I didn't think my grandfather would have this, but he looks at me and goes, Evan, go back in my office top shelf, there's 2 light blue books. It was a Cincino translation of the of Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. So it's like he had bought it as a medical thought book. I was learning it as a rabbinic study book.
Same book.
Same book. One was in the translation. The other one was in the original Hebrew Aramaic. But unfortunately, while I'm 95% auditory, I don't necessarily understand things that I read very well.
Mm-hmm.
So all the lectures were still given in English and Hebrew in YU. So I was able to follow the lecture, but I couldn't necessarily understand the text itself. So by having the translation that my grandfather gave me, I could actually follow along a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mentioned that my grandparents were not observant. Like, they weren't Torah observant Jews, but they were very proud Jews. And like all 3 of their children still identified as Jewish. All 3 of their grandchildren are Jewish and married Jewish. All 6 of their great-grandchildren are being raised Jewish. But my grandmother tells the story from when she was growing up, it was not such a great thing to be known as Jewish. So my grandmother actually told me a story one time of when they first moved back from Louisiana to Dallas, and my grandfather opened his practice in Oak Cliff. She's working as the office manager and gets a phone call. "Are you the new Jewish doctor in town?" And she was terrified.
Oh my.
Because growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, it wasn't such a great thing to be a Jew.
Pretty much nowhere in the South, but, you know. So did they have any, I guess, issues or problems with people accepting them?
As far as I know, they didn't have any problems accepting them. I one time asked my grandfather, because he grew up at Tiferet, Israel. It was his grandfather's synagogue. So I asked him at one point, I grew up, they were always members of Temple Emmanuel. So I went to my grandfather, I'm like, how'd you move from Tiferet to Temple? And he goes, Evan, when I was 13, I wanted to continue my Jewish studies. The only synagogue that had a post-bar mitzvah Jewish education program at that point was Temple Emmanuel. So he went and took his paperboy route money and joined Temple on his own.
Wow.
Still maintaining his membership at Tiferet Israel, but for the school he joined Temple. And by the time he was having kids of his own, my mother grew up at Temple Emmanuel. My aunt used to teach bar mitzvah students at Temple. My parents their wedding was in Lefkowitz Chapel at Temple.
So of your parents' generation, or even your are there any survivors? Are there
Of my grandparents' generation, my grandfather was the last of his generation. He outlived his little sister, outlived his brother-in-law. My grandmother died 2 years before he did, or about 1.5 years before he did.
Mm-hmm.
So of that generation, there are no more buyers. My mother has, in her generation, there's her first cousin, Jeanette Pincus, and David Schwartz, who's Jeanette's brother, now lives in D.C. area.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have Jeanette and Michael Pincus are in that generation. You also have other members of the family that aren't necessarily first cousins, but the other fun one that you get is my grandmother's niece moved to Dallas a few years before I was born. So even from my grandmother's side of the family, she was an import, but she brought her family with her too. The kind of fun one is I looked at it, and in my generation, I have no first cousins, but I got a bunch of second cousins, because my aunt and uncle never married long enough to have children. But I've got cousins from both sides of my family, given my father wasn't born in Dallas, but he brought some family to Dallas too. As it turns out, yeah, I mentioned my wife's from Huntington Beach, California. My brother moved a couple years ago from Dallas, where he had brought his wife from Florida back to Dallas for the beginning of their marriage, and they've got 2 kids. And then you have my little brother is the first one of us to actually marry a fellow Texan. And one of the funniest ones I had with that one is, so my sister-in-law is Amanda Rudy, my little brother's Michael Rosenhouse. My grandfather is Jerome Byers, who was classmates with Sam Rudy, who's my sister-in-law's grandfather.
How funny.
But when I say they were classmates, it was Woodrow Wilson High School, and they knew each other's names in passing. It was still a large enough school where they didn't necessarily know each other or were friendly, but yeah, they knew of each other. Mm-hmm. Going back to involvement in Judaism, let's see, my uncle, my brother, and my older brother and I were members of Morton Lewis ACA. My little brother was in Monsky. My mother was in Wadle. My aunt was, I believe, in Soblosky, BBG. My little brother he was in Monsky, was the beau for Weinstein, BBG, which kind of funnily, so was, if I remember correctly, I think Scott, my cousin Scott, was also beau for Weinstein a few years before.
How funny.
So it's kind of funny.
You stayed involved in the community. Were you ever ordained when you?
Unfortunately, I didn't do well on tests.
It's hard, yeah.
So while I've got the training to actually be a rabbi, and Yitz Cohen would have loved me to be a rabbi, it as of yet has not worked out. One of my favorite ones was, I remember at one point we moved over to Tiferet, Israel, as I said, by my brother's bar mitzvah. And for anyone who doesn't know, Yitz Cohen, the man, bless his heart, stands maybe 5'1".
Hi.
So Rabbi Cohen was originally brought to Dallas, I believe, as cantor for Tiferet, Israel. And my grandparents were one of the families that helped introduce him to Dallas. But I was supposed to be part of the choir the year they disbanded the choir. So I remember at one point he goes, okay, we're going to have choir rehearsal. And then he goes, okay, you're going to sit over here, you're going to sit over there. And he basically took the choir members and dispersed them throughout Tiferet, Israel, which at least at that point was 2 separate columns of seats and 2 mixed columns of seats. Now with Rabbi Sabo, there's a permanent mechitza down the middle. But the reason I bring up the seating arrangement was he goes, okay, you guys are now section leaders. We are going to have a choir of the entire congregation.
That's pretty smart.
Singing along. The only hard part was you get something like the choir master keeping his pattern, being Rabbi Cohen was the choir master still, having previously been the cantor. His son Yaakov, also known as Jake, was by that point the chazan, the cantor. And he would keep his pattern. So you would see like stare down competitions between the two going, okay, who's in charge of the service? Is it the rabbi or the cantor?
They were great though.
But
Just amazing.
that duo was, yeah, it's amazing. The funniest one, one of the funniest ones I had with, in particular, Yaakov Cohen, was I remember while I was in Yeshiva University, I one time went, and someone sees me on the street and goes, "Hey, Tex." My name at YU is Tex. He goes, "Hey, Tex, do you know this guy from Dallas? His name's Jake Cohen." I said, "Jake Cohen? No, I don't know Jake Cohen. His father's the rabbi." I'm like, "You mean Yaakov?" So, okay. So the funny one was, a few years, I relayed the story over to, I stayed with, by that point I was now Shomer Shabbat, but we were still, my parents live all the way up north, across from what's now the Chavetz Chaim Yeshiva, up at Davenport and Frankfurt. Well, Tiferet Israel's Hillcrest and Royal was a 20-minute drive away. I can't walk that far on Yom Kippur especially. So I'm staying with Rabbi Cohen at his house by Tiferet Israel. During the break on Yom Kippur, I'm sitting with Yaakov and Mara in one of the side rooms at Tiferet Israel. And she says to me, "You know, I had the exact opposite experience. I grew up, I came back to Dallas having been dating this guy from Brandeis named Jake. And these old ladies come up to me, 'It's so nice that you and Yaakov are getting married.'" She had never met Yaakov Cohen in her life.
Oh, it's just Jake.
She knew him as Jake Cohen.
I never heard him be called Jake.
So the fun one was, it turns out, what was it? For high school, Yaakov had gone from Akiba Academy in Dallas. He went to, there was no high school at that point when he graduated from middle school. So he went up to Skokie Yeshiva outside of Chicago. Well, there's a lot of Yaakovs or Jacobs or, common Jewish name. So usually what do? Okay, we'll call them all by last name. How many people do you think there are that are named A. Cohen? So he became Jake.
That's funny.
So here's a guy who I met in YU that knew Yaakov from high school.
And from Skokie, I was just in Skokie a couple weeks ago. That's fine. I never knew his name Jake. That's funny. Wow. So, tell me more about, I guess, just generally. Did you work with the other, like Debbie Linksman and Rabbi Shaw and all of you worked together, I'm sure, in the kashrut and all that? Tell me how that is, or how that went,